The rescue party had not prepared for the smell of bread. Sheriff James Colton was 44 years old on the morning of January 15th, 1888, and he had lived in Dakota Territory long enough to know what silence meant when it settled over a homestead in the middle of a blizzard. He had buried neighbors. He had carried frozen bodies out of farmhouses where the stoves had gone cold and the windows had frosted from the inside soon. He had learned over 11 winters to read the particular stillness of a structure that had stopped protecting the people inside it. That morning, his party had visited 4 homesteads before reaching the edge of the Merritt claim. At the first, a father had lost 3 fingers to frostbite. His children were wrapped in curtains because every blanket had been used to stuff the gaps in the walls. At the second, they found a woman frozen on her kitchen floor, with her youngest child still in her arms. At the third and fourth, families had burned their furniture, then their floorboards, feeding the iron stoves piece by piece until there was nothing left to feed them. 4 homesteads, 4 iron stoves, 4 versions of the same story. Now Colton sat on horseback in front of a tar paper shack at the edge of a claim that the land office had written off in August, and he looked at the chimney pipe rising above the roofline and saw no smoke coming from it. In 40 below weather, no smoke meant one of 2 things. Either the fire had gone out and the people inside were dead, or there was no one left to tend it. He had learned over 11 winters that these 2 possibilities amounted to the same thing. He dismounted. The snow came past his knees. He waded toward the door, and one of the men behind him began to speak the first words of a prayer, not the kind you say for the living. Then the wind shifted, and James Colton stopped walking. The smell reached him before he could explain it. Not smoke, not the acrid ghost of a fire that had died hours ago. Something else. Something warm and ordinary and impossible. The smell of bread, fresh bread rising and browning, filling the cold air with the kind of warmth that belongs inside kitchens where everything is fine and no one is dying. Colton stood in the snow with his mouth slightly open and stared at the silent chimney pipe and did not move for a long moment. He would think about that smell for the rest of his life. 7 months earlier, in the full heat of a Nebraska summer, Owen Merritt sat beside his father's bed in a boarding room that smelled of dust and sickness and watched the last hours arrange themselves with the slow, deliberate cruelty that fever reserves for the people who deserve it least. Edmund Merritt was 41 years old, and he had wanted land more than he had ever wanted anything else in his life. Not the things that land could produce, not comfort or security or the slow accumulation of prosperity. The land itself, the right to stand on a piece of earth and say, "This is mine," and have it be true. He had carried that want across an ocean and down 1,000 miles of American dirt road, and he had carried it all the way to a piece of paper from the Dakota Land Office that promised him 160 acres of prairie if he could survive long enough to claim them. He would not survive long enough. Owen held his father's hand and felt the bones of it through the dry skin and watched the light move through the single window at an angle that made the dust motes look like small stars falling slowly through the air. Edmund's hand had held plow handles and fence posts in the hands of his children. Now it held nothing except the last few hours of its own life. The last clear words Edmund spoke were in German. He said, "Land, Owen. Do not lose the land." After that, there was only delirium. Fields that did not exist. Names of people who were not in the room. The fever geography of a dying man's mind mapping the distance between what he had wanted and what he would never have. Owen sat with his father until the end. He did not cry. The well had been running dry for days, and by the time Edmund stopped breathing, there was nothing left to draw from it. He did not hear the knock at the door the following morning. He was sitting in the chair beside the empty bed when the door opened and Horace Webb stepped inside. Webb owned the boarding house. He was a practical man in the way that certain men become practical when money is the only language they have learned to speak fluently. He looked at the empty bed, and then he looked at Owen, and then he said that he understood this was a difficult time, but that the room had been paid through the end of the week, and he would need it back on Friday. Owen stood up. He did not say anything. He simply rose from the chair and looked at Webb with the particular stillness of a person who has just understood something new about the world, something he cannot unknow. There was no anger in it. There was no grief. There was only the cold recognition that some people would always look at him and see a problem that needed solving, and that the only way to escape that gaze was to become someone who could not be solved. Iris was 15 years old and standing in the doorway behind her brother, and she watched all of it. She watched the way Webb looked at them. She watched the way Owen went quiet. She stored the information the way she stored everything that seemed important, carefully, completely, without deciding yet what she would do with it. 3 days later, Winifred Merritt called her daughter into the corner of their room after Owen had fallen into the shallow, exhausted sleep that had replaced proper rest for weeks. Winifred was 38 years old. She had crossed an ocean and buried a husband and was still moving because she did not know how to stop. But something in the set of her shoulders had changed since the cemetery. Some fundamental load-bearing structure had shifted, and Iris had been watching it with the careful attention of a daughter who understood things her mother had not yet said aloud. Winifred knelt beside the trunk in the corner and reached past the folded clothes and the tin plates and the small Bible with the cracked spine to the very bottom where the most important things were kept. She pulled out a notebook bound in cracked leather. It was old in the way that objects become old through use rather than neglect. The leather was soft and darkened by the oils of many hands. The pages were yellowed and slightly wavy, the way paper becomes when it has traveled through humidity and dryness and humidity again. When Iris took it from her mother's hands, the smell rose from the pages like a memory she had almost forgotten she owned. Wood smoke, dried herbs, wet earth, the smell of her grandmother's kitchen in Ukraine 4 years and an ocean away. "This was your grandmother's," Winifred said in German. Her voice was steady but thin, pulled tight across something she was not naming. "I was going to wait until you were older, but I do not know how much time I have. Take it. Remember what she taught you. Clay is stronger than iron. Clay is more faithful than iron. Do not ever forget." Iris was 15. She held the notebook in both hands and felt the weight of it, which was heavier than leather and paper had any right to be. She did not understand why her mother was speaking like someone saying goodbye. Her mother was only 38. People did not die at 38. But something in Winifred's voice, some final quality that Iris could not name, but her body recognized, made her close her fingers around the notebook and press it against her chest. "I will not forget," she said. Winifred reached out and touched her daughter's face. The gesture was so gentle, it was almost not there at all, a thing made of intention more than pressure. And Iris would remember the exact weight of it for the rest of her life. 17 days later, Winifred Merritt collapsed in the yard of a way station in eastern Nebraska. She fell the way a building falls when the foundation gives out, not slowly, not with warning, but all at once. The doctor who examined her said her heart had simply stopped. There was no medical explanation. There was no need for one. Anyone who had seen her face in those 17 days understood exactly why her heart had stopped. Owen and Iris buried their mother beside a small white church in a town whose name they would forget within a year. They stood at the grave for a long time. They did not cry. There was nothing left. Owen spoke first. His voice was rough in the way that voices become rough when they have been used only for the words you say at deathbeds and grave sites, the words that wear out your voice from the inside. "We should go back," he said. "Find work in a town. I can hire on as a stable hand, a fence builder. We can get a room somewhere and keep our heads down and figure out the rest later." It was a reasonable plan. It was the plan that any sensible person would have made for 2 orphan children with $43 and no particular skills that anyone on the Dakota prairie was willing to pay for. It was the plan of caution, the plan of survival. Iris was quiet for so long that Owen thought she had agreed. She had not agreed. She held up the notebook. The cracked leather caught the afternoon light, and for a moment it looked less like a book and more like a door. "We go to Dakota," she said. "We claim the land. That is what Father wanted. That is what Mother told us to do. We have this." Owen looked at his sister. 15 years old, chin lifted, hands steady, wearing an expression he recognized from their mother's face the morning after their father died. the expression of a person who has already decided and is not available for persuasion. He agreed not because he believed in the plan, but because he was his father's son, and abandoning the land would be a second betrayal on top of the first. But that night, lying on the hard ground of their campsite with Copper curled against his legs, Owen sat with a shame that he could not quite set down. He was 18. He was the older sibling. He was supposed to be the protector, the planner, the one who stood between his family and whatever the world intended to do to them. But the plan was coming from his 15-year-old sister, and the best he could offer was the strength of his back and the willingness to follow. Some protector he was. The shame was quiet and persistent the way a stone in your boot is quiet and persistent. You can walk with it, you can function, but you feel it with every step. They arrived in Freeman, Dakota Territory in the first week of August, 1887. The wagon creaked in ways that suggested it had made its last long journey. The brown dog named Copper trotted alongside his coat, catching the summer light in ways that justified the name. And at the bottom of a canvas bag, wedged under the wagon seat, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was the notebook that Margaret Hartwell had filled over 72 winters of testing and refining and getting things right and getting things wrong and getting them right again. The land they had claimed came with a structure, if you were willing to call it that. The previous homesteader had abandoned it after a single winter, leaving behind a tar paper shack 12 feet wide and 14 feet long. The walls were thin enough that daylight came through in several places, thin beams that moved across the dirt floor as the sun crossed the sky, marking the hours like a sundial. Each beam was a place where wind could enter. Each beam was a failure of the wall to do the one thing walls are supposed to do. A cracked iron stove sat in one corner. The crack ran diagonally across the firebox door, and when you opened it, the hinge screamed in the way that hinges scream when they have been neglected for a long time and have opinions about it. The nearest timber was 40 miles away. Coal was available at the Freeman Supply Store at a price that would exhaust their remaining money in approximately 6 weeks. These were the mathematics of survival on the Dakota Prairie in 1887, and they were not kind mathematics. On the third day, Douglas Hale arrived. He was 50 years old and wore a coat that had never been dirty and boots polished recently enough to still hold a shine on the dusty prairie. He moved through the world with the assurance of someone for whom warmth had always been a baseline condition of existence rather than a daily negotiation. He walked around the shack once slowly the way a man walks around something he is appraising for purchase. He looked at the cracked stove. He looked at the thin walls. He looked at the two children standing in the yard with a brown dog sitting between them, the dog's tail making its slow, hopeful arc through the dust. Then he wrote something in his leather notebook and said without looking at them, "Survival prospects. None. I will recommend this claim be reassigned by spring." He said it the way a man reads a weather report. Matter of fact, impersonal, as though those two words were simply a notation in a ledger rather than a judgment about the last days of two young lives. What Iris did not know, what she would not learn until years later, was what Douglas Hale did when he returned to his office that afternoon. He wrote 2 letters. The first went to a man named Preston Ward, a rancher from Sioux Falls who had the kind of wealth that comes from buying land cheaply from people who cannot afford to keep it. Ward had been watching this particular claim for 2 years. It sat at the center point between 2 reliable water sources, a position that made it valuable to someone who understood the geometry of grazing. The letter informed Ward that the land would be vacant by spring. 2 children, no funds, no timber. Nature will do its part. We need only wait. The second document was a note to himself, a reminder to deny any application the Merritt children might file for federal homesteader credit, the program that allowed first winter settlers to purchase coal on deferred payment. There would simply be a form that never got filed, a door that closed before anyone realized it had been open. Iris did not know about the letters, but she read something on Hale's face as he prepared to ride away that afternoon, a quality she could not yet name. But her body registered the way the body registers temperature before the mind catches up. It was not the indifference of a bureaucrat performing dreary work. It was the faint, private satisfaction of a man who has set something in motion and is pleased with the direction it is moving. She stepped forward. She was smaller than Hale by nearly a foot, and lighter by 100 pounds, and younger by 35 years, and she stepped toward him the way a person steps towards something they intend to move. "We will be here in the spring," she said, each word placed carefully the way a bricklayer places bricks, making sure each one is level before reaching for the next. "We will be here every spring after that. This land belongs to us." Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled the way that men of his type smile at children who do not yet understand how the world works. A smile that is not a smile at all, but a dismissal wearing a smile's clothing. "We shall see," he said. He put his notebook in his coat pocket, turned his horse, and rode away. Owen watched him go. When the dust had settled, he turned to his sister. "How," he said, "how do we survive? Winter with no wood, no coal, and no money." Iris reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook. She held it up so the afternoon light caught the cracked leather. "Not with wood," she said, "not with coal, with this." That evening, while Owen slept and Copper breathed his contented dog-shaped breathing at the foot of the bedroll, Iris sat on the dirt floor of the tar paper shack and opened her grandmother's notebook. The smell came first, same smell that had risen from the pages when her mother handed it to her at the end. Wood smoke and dried herbs and the particular dampness of old European earth. The smell of Margaret Hartwell's kitchen on the Ukrainian steppe, where Iris had spent one summer at the age of 11, learning things she did not yet know she would need. The handwriting inside was precise and clear. The hand of a woman who had written these words many times before, refining each sentence the way she had refined each technique, cutting away everything that was not essential. Page after page of dimensions and ratios and channel diagrams. Notes in the margins in faded German ink. River clay is best. Add straw cut to the length of your hand no longer. Dried manure horse or cow mixed in equal parts with the straw for thermal endurance. The firebox must be no wider than 2 hands placed side by side. The first channel turns left, always left. This was not a set of instructions. It was a conversation that had begun in a farmyard in Ukraine when Iris was 11 years old and Margaret was 68, when they had spent a long summer afternoon building a small demonstration stove from clay and straw while the swallows made their noise in the eaves above them. Iris remembered the weight of the wet clay in her hands, the smell of it mixed with the cut straw, something earthy and sharp, at the same time like bread dough combined with freshly turned soil. Her grandmother's fingers guiding hers, showing her how to feel for the right consistency, not by measuring, but by touch. "The way you know when dough has been kneaded enough," Margaret had said. "Not because you have counted the folds, because your hands recognize the moment when it stops being ingredients and becomes something new." When the small demonstration stove was finished and the fire inside it had burned down and gone quiet, Margaret had pressed her palm against its whitewashed surface and held it there. Not hot, not burning, warm, steady and reliable, the kind of warmth you could lean against. "This is how our people outsmart the cold," Margaret had said, "not by having more than the cold, by being smarter than it." Iris had been 11. She had understood it the way you understand things at 11, as something true and interesting that belonged to the world of adults filed away for later. She had not known what later would look like. She had not known it would look like this: a dirt floor in Dakota Territory, a cracked stove in the corner, $43, and a winter coming. She needed it now. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest. Half a mile to the west, along the bank of the creek that ran through the bottom of their claim, there was blue-gray clay lying in the earth. The kind that farmers cursed because it stuck to everything and drained their fields badly. The kind that Margaret Hartwell had recognized 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge ago as something entirely different from what most people believed it to be. The morning after next, before Owen woke, Iris walked to the creek and knelt in the mud and tested it. 6 inches below the topsoil, her fingers found something dense and cool and plastic. She pulled up a handful and squeezed it, and rolled it, and bent it, and watched the way it held its shape. different from the Ukrainian clay, bluer than gray with a slight grit that the other lacked, but close enough. Physics did not require identical material. Physics only required the right properties, and this clay had them. She carried it back to the shack, cupped in both hands. Owen did not understand what his sister was proposing. He was a practical young man who believed in things he could see and verify. Iron stoves existed in every house manufactured by people who knew what they were doing. Clay stoves existed only in their grandmother's notebook and his sister's memory. He said as much that evening, sitting across from Iris on the dirt floor with copper stretched out between them and the candle throwing long shadows against the tar paper walls. "What if you are wrong?" he said. His voice was not angry. It was tired in the way that people become tired when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and are beginning to wonder if they will ever be allowed to set it down. What if grandmother was wrong? She lived in Ukraine, not Dakota. The soil is different. The wind is different. Everything is different. Iris looked at him. She was quiet for a long moment, not because she lacked an answer, but because she was choosing her words with the care of someone who understands that the person across from them is arguing not from stubbornness, but from fear, and that fear requires a gentler kind of answer than stubbornness does. One that acknowledges the fear before it offers the reason not to be afraid. Physics does not change with continents. "Owen," she said, and then quieter with something in her voice she had not used since for Nebraska, "you dig clay better than anyone I have ever known. If this stove works, half the credit belongs to your hands." That was the truth. Without someone to haul hundreds of pounds of wet clay half a mile each day, the notebook was only paper. Owen's physical labor was not less important than Iris's inherited knowledge. They needed each other completely and without substitution. It would just take time for Owen to believe it. He did not agree because he was convinced. He agreed because he was his father's son. So he dug. He dug clay from the creek bank every morning before the sun rose too high and every evening before the light failed. He carried it back in buckets that started heavy and grew heavier with each trip as the distance seemed to lengthen, even though the distance did not change. His hands blistered on the third day. The skin rose in white bubbles that broke and stung when the wet clay pressed into them. They healed. They blistered again. They healed harder. In those walks between the creek and the shack, with the buckets pulling at his shoulders and Copper trotting alongside with the patient companionship of a dog who has found his people and intends to keep them, Owen talked. Not to anyone, just to the buckets, to the prairie, to the particular quality of open space that accepts whatever you say to it without judgment or response. He talked about his father, about the sound of Edmund's voice when he said the word land. He talked about his mother standing at the grave, still as a photograph. He talked about the shame, the particular quiet shame of following his 15-year-old sister's plan because he could not think of a better one. Copper listened to all of it without interruption, without advice, without the sideways glances that humans give when they are deciding how to respond. The dog walked alongside Owen with his ears up and his tail doing its slow, steady sweep and his eyes on Owen's face, and he listened with the complete attention that only dogs possess, the kind that says, "I understand everything important without needing to understand a single word." Owen started calling him the best listener he had ever met. It was a joke. It was also true. And it was a phrase he would remember years later standing over a small stone in the cold January ground with a carving tool in his hand. Iris spent those same weeks building her brick army. She cut straw from the edge of the prairie with a knife and mixed it into the clay with dried manure collected from the field behind the shack, working the combination in a wooden trough until the proportions felt right, not by measuring, by the way her hands recognized it. She poured the mixture into wooden molds she had built from scrap lumber left by the previous homesteader, smoothed the tops, and set them in the sun to dry. Then she made more, and more after that. The rows spread across the yard until they covered most of the ground around the shack, hundreds of handmade bricks standing in formation, and from a distance, the abandoned claim looked less like a homestead and more like something that had decided deliberately to organize itself into something useful. People noticed, People talked. Edna Cartwright stopped her wagon at the edge of the yard one afternoon and looked at the rows of drying bricks for a long time without speaking. Then she clicked her tongue once, or the way you click your tongue at something that has confirmed what you already suspected, and drove on. That evening, she told her husband what she had seen, and by the following week, everyone in Freeman had heard about the Merritt children and their mud bricks. The story gained weight and lost accuracy at every stop, but its conclusion never varied. Those poor children had lost their minds. Iris heard the laughter at the supply store. She saw the pitying eyes. She did not react, not because it did not reach her, but because there was no time for it. Winter was coming and the bricks needed to dry, and the foundation needed to be cleared, and the notebook's specifications needed to be translated from the measurements of Margaret Hartwell's Ukrainian kitchen into the dimensions of a 14-foot Dakota shack. Then Billy Crane arrived. He was 25 years old and loud, in the way that young men with an audience are loud, and he came with two friends on a morning in early October because he had heard the story and wanted to see it for himself. He walked around the yard looking at the bricks, and then he looked at the half-built structure visible through the open door of the shack, and he laughed out loud, the kind of laugh that is designed to carry. $5, he said to his friends, loud enough so Iris could not possibly miss it. $5 says they do not make it to Christmas. Owen was 20 feet away. He crossed the distance between them without running, without hurrying, without any external sign of urgency. He simply walked to the place between Billy Crane and his sister and stopped there. He did not speak. He just stood, thinner than Billy, shorter than Billy, younger than Billy, standing with the particular stillness of a person who has already lost everything and therefore has nothing left to protect except the thing standing behind him. Billy Crane's laughter died. He looked at Owen for a moment. Then he and his friends left. It was a small moment, but in it, Owen found something. Not a plan, not a vision, something smaller and more immediate. He was the person who stood between his sister and the world. That was a real thing. That was his. Father Aldrich came on a cool morning in late September. He was 55, the Irish priest who served the Catholic community of Turner County, and he had the particular combination of genuine faith and institutional caution that sometimes produces a man who is better at protecting a structure than serving the people inside it. He walked among the rows of bricks and then looked at the half-built structure through the door and asked where this knowledge came from. From my grandmother, Iris said, 300 years old, from the Ukraine. Father Aldrich's eyes narrowed slightly. 300 years, he repeated, before the church came to those lands. Iris understood what he was suggesting. The shape of it was familiar. The implication that knowledge which predated the church might have originated somewhere the church did not approve of, dressed up in the language of religious concern. The cold does not care about the church, she said quietly. The cold only cares about physics. Father Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slightly and rode away. The following Sunday in a sermon, he mentioned the danger of relying on old knowledge from pagan lands rather than trusting in God's providence. He did not name the Merritt children. He did not need to. The consequences were immediate and practical. Several of the devout Irish Catholic families who took Father Aldrich's word as something close to divine instruction began actively avoiding the Merritt homestead, not from hatred, from the social calculus of a small community where association carries cost. Nora Flynn was 19 years old, red-haired and freckled Irish, and she had been coming to the Merritt homestead for 2 weeks before the sermon, walking among the drying bricks and touching them and asking questions that actually wanted answers. How does heat move through clay differently than through iron? What happens inside the structure when the fire burns down? Why does the floor get warm? She came back after the sermon, but the next time she came, her mother walked beside her and sat in the yard throughout the entire visit, not participating, but not leaving either. That was how Mrs. Doris Flynn expressed the things she could not say aloud. I do not understand what my daughter is doing, but I will not let her do it alone. Nora would pay a social price for her continued presence at the Merritt homestead. She was 19 years old and she had decided that her reputation was less important than asking the right questions. That decision would cost her things she had not yet counted. It would also give her things she had not yet imagined. On the morning of the day, she first walked out to the creek bank to test the clay. Iris had risen before Owen, before even the gray suggestion of light in the east, and walked half a mile through the dark with nothing but the creek's sound to guide her. She found the clay by feel more than by sight, digging 6 inches into the bank with her bare hands until her fingers closed around something cold and dense and yielding. She pulled it up and held it in her palm, squeezed it, rolled it, felt the way it remembered the shape she gave it. She knelt there for a long time holding that earth. Consider what was true at that moment. Her parents were dead. Her money was almost gone. Every adult she had encountered since arriving in Freeman had told her in various ways that she would not survive. Douglas Hale had put it in writing. A priest had suggested from the pulpit that her knowledge was suspect. Her own brother followed her plan, not from belief, but from the absence of a better one. And she was kneeling at a creek bank in Dakota Territory, holding a handful of blue-gray clay, thinking about a summer afternoon in Ukraine when she was 11 years old, and her grandmother's hands were guiding her hands, and the air smelled of wet earth and cut straw, and everything that had happened since had not yet happened. The knowledge had traveled from Margaret Hartwell's hands to her hands, across an ocean, and through 2 graves. It lived in the muscles of her fingers in the way she already knew, before she had consciously worked it out, that this clay needed slightly more straw than the Ukrainian formula called for to compensate for the added grit, and that the proportions of the firebox would need a small adjustment to account for the drier Dakota air. The principle did not change. The principle had been tested by 3 centuries of Ukrainian winters, none of which had cared about national origin or parental status or the $43 in a canvas bag under a wagon seat. Cold was cold. Physics was physics. Clay held heat. And the chain that ran from Margaret Hartwell's hands to the hands of every woman who had learned from her and passed the learning forward had come to rest, at least for now, in the hands of a 15-year-old girl kneeling in the mud of a Dakota Creek bank in the early morning dark. The chain had not broken yet. She stood up. She carried the clay back to the shack, cupped in both hands carefully because it was. Nora Flynn had never once asked a question she did not actually want answered. That was the thing Owen noticed first before anything else. Not the red hair or the freckles or the directness of her gaze. The quality of her attention when Iris spoke. Most people who came to look at the drying bricks wore their doubt on their faces the way people wear clothing they have already decided belongs to them. Nora wore something different. She wore the focused, slightly forward-leaning expression of a person who is trying to understand a thing because she has decided understanding it matters. She came back the second day. And the third, she started helping carry bricks without being asked, picking up the rhythm of the work the way a person picks up the rhythm of a song they have heard enough times to feel in their body before they know the words. She asked about the channel geometry. She asked why the floor temperature mattered. She asked what happened inside the structure during the hours after the fire burned down, when everything went quiet and the clay was left alone with the heat it had absorbed. Iris answered each question once and completely, and Nora listened the way her dog listened, which was the highest compliment Owen had in his inventory at that point in his life. He began timing his returns from the creek bank to coincide with her arrivals. He never acknowledged this arrangement out loud. Neither did she. But on the 4th morning, he came back 40 minutes earlier than necessary and found her already there. And when she looked up from the brick she was carrying, neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them needed to. One afternoon in the 2nd week of October, Nora found Owen sitting beside the creek with a full bucket of clay beside him and his hands resting on his knees staring at the water. She sat down a few feet away without asking if she should. The creek moved between them. The meadowlarks were making their final arguments of the afternoon before the light failed. After a long while, Owen spoke without looking at her. "I do not know if my sister is right," he said. "I dig the clay and I carry it, and I do what she asks because I cannot think of anything better. But if she is wrong, part of that is mine, because I did not think of anything better." Nora was quiet long enough to show she was not reaching for the first response that came to hand. When she spoke, her voice was level and careful, the voice of someone choosing words the way you choose a tool for a specific job. Or, part of the credit is yours, she said, because you dig clay every single day for a plan you do not yet believe in. That is the most honest kind of courage, the kind that does not wait for certainty before it starts. Owen turned and looked at her. He had been called many things since Nebraska: unfortunate, determined, stubborn, pitiable in the eyes of people who thought pitiable was something they were permitted to think privately. No one had called him courageous, especially not for the thing that cost him the most, which was doing the work before he believed in the outcome. That was the morning Owen Merritt began to change. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way stories sometimes describe change as a sudden reordering of everything at once. In the small, durable way that real change happens, one repaired piece at a time. Silas Graves arrived on a Tuesday in the third week of October and did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the edge of the yard, 72 years old, and shaped by 3 decades of Dakota prairie into something that looked less like a man and more like a feature of the landscape. And he stood in front of the partially constructed stove visible through the open door of the shack and examined it with the unhurried attention of a craftsman who has spent a lifetime learning how to read other people's work. His eyes moved over the brick courses, the proportions of the firebox, opening the placement of the first channel turn. Then he said quietly and without preamble, "I saw one of these in Bergen 50 years ago before I came to America. An old man had built it in his kitchen. They called it a Russian stove. I was 17. I put my hand on it, and it was warm and there was no fire burning." I asked him how. He said the fire finished hours ago, but the clay remembers. Iris felt something move in her chest, the particular sensation of a weight that has been carried alone suddenly finding a second pair of hands. "My grandmother called it that too," she said. She said the knowledge came down from the steppe, peoples through centuries of winters that would kill you if you did not understand them. 300 years of knowing what to do when everything else fails. Silas nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has lived long enough to recognize that the most reliable things are usually the oldest things, and that the world has a persistent habit of forgetting them in favor of whatever is newer and louder and less proven. He looked at her for a long moment. "You have your grandmother's eyes," he said. He tipped his hat. He walked away. But Iris stood in the doorway and watched him go and felt for the first time since the Nebraska cemetery that the weight on her shoulders had shifted. Not disappeared. Shifted. The difference between carrying something alone and carrying something with the knowledge that at least one other person in the world understands what it is and why it matters. 2 days after Silas Graves visited Douglas Hale, rode out to see Gerald Ashford. Gerald had farmed in Turner County for 16 years, and in those 16 years, he had accumulated the particular kind of authority that comes not from titles or money, but from having been present through enough bad things to have earned the right to speak about them. People listened to Gerald Ashford because Gerald Ashford had seen what he was talking about. Hale knew this. That was why he had come. He sat in Gerald's kitchen and said, with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to deliver bad news as though it were good advice that he had heard about the clay construction project on the Merritt claim. He said there were concerns in the community about structural safety. He said that if anything went wrong, if there were a fire, if the thing collapsed, the legal status of the claim would need to be reviewed. And he said that in that event, it would be helpful to have a respected voice in the community who could confirm that the structure had appeared unstable from the beginning. He did not say this as a threat. That was what made it effective. He said it as a reasonable contingency plan, the way a careful man discusses possibilities before they become problems. Gerald listened to all of it without expression. He was thinking about the winter of 1881. He was thinking about 8 cords of split hardwood buried under 4 feet of compacted snow. He was thinking about the iron stove that had consumed everything he fed it and then gone cold in the night. He was thinking about his daughter Grace, 7 years old, who had died before dawn in a room that should have been warm enough to save her. He had spent 7 years asking a question he could not answer: whether there was something he had missed, something he had failed to know that a better man would have known. When Hale finished speaking, Gerald looked at him for a moment and then said, "I will say what I see, nothing more." Hale left. Gerald sat in his kitchen for a long time after the sound of the horse faded. Then he put on his coat and walked out to the Merritt claim. He did not explain why he had come. He simply stood in front of the partially built stove and placed his palm against the clay surface and held it there. The structure was not finished. The firing had not yet begun. The clay was cool under his hand, just shaped earth that had not yet been tested. But Gerald kept his hand there anyway, as though he were asking a question of the material that only time would be able to answer. Is there a better way? He left without speaking. 3 days later, a bundle of twisted prairie grass appeared on the Merritt doorstep. No name, no note. Iris picked it up and understood immediately because she understood what it cost a man like Gerald Ashford to leave something like that. The admission that he might have been wrong, that the children he had advised to leave might know something he did not. It was the first material support they had received from anyone in Freeman. It weighed almost nothing. It was the most valuable thing anyone had given them since they arrived. Walter Brennan rode in from the east on a gray morning in the last week of October and tied his horse to the fence post with the practiced efficiency of a man who has something specific to do and does not want to spend time on the things that are not it. He was 40 years old, a bricklayer by trade and by everything else that shaped him, the son of German-Russian settlers who had come to the American plains carrying the knowledge of the Volga River settlements in their hands, the way other immigrants carried money or furniture. He had heard about the Merritt homestead from Edna Cartwright, who had told the story with the particular relish of a person who believes she is distributing useful information when she is actually distributing gossip. Walter Brennan had not found the story amusing. He had gone very quiet in a way that happened when something activated a memory he had stopped expecting to surface. He stood in front of the half-built stove for a long time. His eyes moved across the brickwork the way a musician's eyes move across a score, reading the decisions embedded in each course, each angle, each proportion. Then he said, "Where did these plans come from?" His voice had a tightness in it that Iris noticed and could not yet explain. "From my grandmother," she said, "Margaret Hartwell." Walter Brennan's face changed. The tightness shifted into something else entirely, something older and more complicated than she had expected. "I knew a Margaret Hartwell," he said slowly. "When I was a boy in the old country, she was famous in our region. People said she had built more stoves than any man alive. They said she could look at a piece of clay and tell you how many winters it would survive. That was my grandmother." Walter looked at the stove, then at Iris, then back at the stove, reading it again with different eyes, now eyes that understood what they were actually seeing. "You are building it exactly right," he said. "I can see her hands in this work. The same proportions, the same discipline in the channel placement." He paused. "But your bricks could be harder. I can show you a firing technique developed after your grandmother's time from the kilns on the lower Volga. It will make them last 50 years instead of 20. This was not an offer of charity. The distinction mattered enormously. It was an offer made between equals in a craft across time and ocean, and the line between the old world and the new one. One craftsman seeing the work of another craftsman they had known only by reputation, and finding it worthy of the best they could contribute. Iris accepted without hesitation. For the next 2 weeks, Walter Brennan came every day. He and Owen built a small kiln from stacked bricks with a fire pit at the base and a chimney designed to reach temperatures that would transform the soft molded clay into something that rang like a bell when you struck it. He did not teach Owen through explanation. He taught the way the best teachers teach, through demonstration and correction through his hands, showing Owen's hands what right felt like before Owen's mind had the language to describe it. Owen failed. Walter corrected him without comment, without any visible impatience, the way a man corrects a tool that is not yet calibrated to its purpose. Owen tried again. The movements began to migrate from conscious effort into something more reliable, the kind of knowledge that lives in muscle rather than in thought. The kiln became Owen's. This was the discovery. Not the stove itself, which was Iris's design and Iris's knowledge in the long inheritance of Margaret Hartwell's 72 winters of testing, but the kiln and the bricks it produced and the specific skill of reading fire temperature by the color of the flame and the sound of the material at different stages of heat. That belonged to Owen in a way that nothing had belonged to him since his father died. He found it the way you find the right tool for a job you have been doing wrong. Not with fanfare, with the quiet satisfaction of a fit that was always possible and is now finally real. One afternoon when Owen was at the kiln and the sound of his work carried across the yard, Walter said to Iris, "Your grandmother taught my grandmother. My grandmother taught me. You carry one branch of this, I carry another. But it is the same tree." Iris looked at the smoke rising from the kiln. She thought about the chain of hands. Margaret Hartwell to Winifred Merritt, to Iris Merritt, through an ocean and two graves. Margaret Hartwell to Walter Brennan's grandmother, to Walter Brennan, through a different ocean and a different set of losses. Two branches of the same 300-year-old tree meeting in a 14-foot tar paper shack in Dakota Territory. The bricks Owen fired in his kiln rang when you tapped them together, a clear high note with no dullness in it, no wavering. Walter picked one up and held it and turned it in his hands and said nothing for a moment. Then he said it was the best first-week brick he had seen from any student. Owen received this information by looking at the ground for a moment and not speaking. Then he went back to the kiln. The stone in his boot had been getting smaller for days. That afternoon, it disappeared entirely. The stove was completed in the first week of November. It stood in the center of the shack like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for the room to acknowledge it. Whitewashed and solid, taller than Iris's shoulder, wider than Owen's outstretched arms. It dominated the small space the way a certain kind of presence dominates a room, not through aggression or volume, but through the simple, undeniable fact of its existence. The walls of the shack still let light through in thin beams. The cracked iron stove still sat in the corner, where it had always sat, though no one had fed it in weeks. But the room felt different now. It felt like a room that had made a decision. For the first firing, Iris used a double handful of twisted prairie grass. The grass caught immediately and burned hot and bright, filling the firebox with a brief concentrated heat that poured into the channels and began its measured journey through the interior of the structure. Owen stood near the door with his hands at his sides and copper on the floor between him and his sister, the dog's head on his paws, his eyes moving from one human to the other, with the patient attention of an animal that understands something important is happening and has decided to be present for it without complicating it. Nora stood beside Owen, close enough that he could feel the warmth coming from her, not as close as she would someday stand beside him, close enough that it mattered. The grass burned for less than 20 minutes. Then it was done. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has happened and the people in the room are deciding what it means. Iris walked to the stove and placed her palm flat against the whitewashed surface. Warm, not hot. Warm in the steady, unhurried way that the clay had been warmed, absorbing the heat during those 20 minutes of fire, and now releasing it back into the room at exactly the pace the room needed it. She knelt and pressed her hand to the dirt floor beside the base of the stove. The floor was warm. She stood up and looked at Owen, and something settled in her chest that had been unsettled since the Nebraska cemetery. She had known, standing at her mother's grave, that she was the last link in a very old chain. She had known that if she failed, the chain would break. Not just for herself and Owen, for everyone who might ever stand at a creek bank in a cold place holding blue-gray clay and needing to know what their grandmother knew. She had not cried since that grave. She had decided somewhere between Nebraska and Dakota that crying was a thing she would return to later when there was time for it, when they were safe enough that she could afford to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. The grief was there. It had not gone anywhere. It was sitting in her chest, waiting for a stop that had not yet come. But something else was there now, too. Proof, simple, physical, undeniable proof that the knowledge had survived the crossing. That old things did not stop being true because you had carried them a long way from home. Owen knelt and put his hand on the floor. He stayed there longer than he needed to, feeling the warmth rise through his palm. Then he looked up at his sister and said the thing that needed saying. "Give me something to do," he said. "I will not lie here while you keep everyone alive." December came and the stove held. Iris learned its rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of any living thing that shares your space through attention rather than instruction. She knew by the temperature of the floor under her bare feet each morning exactly how much fuel she had used the night before. She knew how the warmth moved through the room at different hours, stronger near the base in the morning, more evenly distributed by afternoon. Owen stopped doubting, not through a single moment of revelation, but through the accumulation of mornings. Each one warm, each one proof that settled on top of the proof before it until the thing was too solid to question any further. Then in the second week of December, Douglas Hale came back. He came in the afternoon when Iris was at the creek checking the clay supply, and only Owen was at the homestead. He tied his horse to the fence moat and walked to the door of the shack, and Owen opened it before he knocked because Copper had heard the horse, and Owen had been expecting something like this for weeks without knowing exactly what shape it would take. Hale was pleasant. He was always pleasant. He said he had heard that the construction project seemed to be progressing, and that was good to know. He said there were still some people in the community with concerns about structural safety, which was understandable given how unusual the approach was. He said that if anything went wrong before spring, if there were any kind of incident, the legal standing of the claim would need to be reviewed. And in that case, it would be unfortunate if there were no established record of the structure having been properly vetted. Owen listened to all of it. He was 18 years old, and this was a 50-year-old man with a government position and a letter in his pocket from a rich man in Sioux Falls who wanted this land, and every word Hale said made complete sense as individual words and as individual sentences. And the thing they assembled together, the actual meaning underneath the pleasant surface, was not pleasant at all. Owen thought about his father. He thought about Nora on the creek bank, saying the word courageous. He thought about 3 months of clay digging and blistered hands in a kiln that now produced bricks that rang like bells. "There will not be an incident," he said. "The stove has been operating for a month. It is the safest structure on this claim. If you would like to examine it, I am happy to show you." Hale regarded him for a moment with the neutral expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of an obstacle he had underestimated. "That will not be necessary," Hale said. He put his hat on. He rode away. Owen stood in the doorway and watched the horse until it disappeared over the rise, and he did not entirely understand why his hands were not shaking. He had expected them to shake. They were steady. When Iris came back from the creek, he told her what had happened without addition or subtraction. She listened completely. Then she looked at him the way their mother used to look at things she had decided were finished being worried about. "You said the right thing," she said. 2 words. But in 2 words, she gave him something he had been waiting for since Nebraska. January arrived the way January always arrives on the Dakota prairie, without apology and without any particular interest in what you had planned. On the morning of the 12th, the temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks. The sky was pale and almost soft. Children ran through the softening snow. Gerald Ashford walked out to repair a section of fence that had come loose in the last cold stretch. Nora Flynn and her mother came to visit the Merritt homestead, and the 5 of them drank hot water from melted snow, and the conversation moved easily between small domestic things and the larger complicated things that people discuss when they have survived something together and have not yet survived the next thing. Owen went outside after breakfast to give Copper space to run. The dog moved through the softened snow with the pure, extravagant joy of a creature that has been cooped indoors and is now receiving the gift of open air in both paws at once. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Iris looked through the window to the west. What she saw was not a cloud. Clouds have edges. Clouds have shapes. What she saw was the replacement of the horizon, a vertical wall of white and gray that stretched from the ground to the top of the visible sky and obliterated everything behind it. Trees, hills, the distant line of the bluffs, the horizon itself, all gone, replaced by white. And it was moving, east, at a speed that belonged to something with intention. Iris watched it for 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the gentle southern wind that had been running all morning, the wind that smelled of melting snow and the suggestion of spring, died. Not faded, died, as though someone had reached over and turned it off. In the silence where the wind had been, a new sound rose, low and distant, a pressure wave moving across the open ground, pushing everything in front of it. Iris was through the door before she had decided to move. Owen. The wall arrived before her voice did. The wind swung from south to northwest in a single moment, and then the white came down. Not gradually, not with the incremental darkening and strengthening that proper storms use to announce themselves. All at once, as though the atmosphere had simply decided to be somewhere else. Owen had seen it coming because Copper had gone rigid 30 seconds before the wall arrived, ears, flat body pointed west tail straight and still. Owen had turned and seen the wall and started running. The wall was faster. Within 60 seconds of the wall's arrival, the world had been reduced to a circle of white, approximately 2 feet in diameter, and even that space was filled with driving ice. Owen was somewhere in that whiteness 40 yards from the door, and Iris was standing in the doorway reaching for the coil of rope she had hung on a nail beside the doorframe in November. 35 cents. She had bought it at the Freeman Supply Store in the second week of November. She had read in an old newspaper lining a shelf in the shack about a farmer in Minnesota who had died between his house and his barn during a whiteout. The distance was 60 feet. The farmer had walked 90 feet in the wrong direction. He was found in the spring less than 20 yards from his own front door. She had read that account the way she read all survival information, without flinching from the implications, but without dwelling on them. The question was not how terrible. The question was how preventable. She tied one end of the rope to the door handle. She wrapped the other end around her wrist twice and knotted it. She stepped into the white. The cold was not the cold she had been living with for months. This was something of an entirely different order, not temperature as a condition of the air, temperature as an active force. She walked with her free arm extended in front of her hands, sweeping through the opaque air, each pass covering as much ground as her reach allowed. 5 steps. 10. The rope pulled taut behind her. 20. She was reaching the limit of the line. She heard something at the bottom of audible range below the register of comprehension, at the frequency where sound becomes vibration, and the body responds before the mind has finished processing. She turned toward it. 7 steps. Her hand found something solid and warm and alive. Copper was pressed against Owen's side with every pound of his body, and he was barking into the wind in the way that an animal barks when it has decided that this is the moment where it either succeeds or fails at the one thing it was put here to do. Owen was on his knees in the snow. His face had the color and quality of something that belonged to a colder world than the one he had been in that morning, and his eyes were open, but not present, looking at something that existed in a place the visible world could not reach. Iris grabbed his arm and put his hand on the rope. "Follow this," she said into the wind that took her voice apart immediately. "Follow this and do not let go." They went back together, hand over hand, step by step. 3 living things connected to each other into the door at the end of a 35-cent rope. When the door appeared out of the white, Iris pulled it open against the wind that fought her for it, and Owen fell inside, and Copper came through the gap behind him, and Iris kicked the door shut. The wind screamed at the closure. The sound it made was the sound of something that had almost had what it came for. Owen lay on the floor. Iris stood against the door with her chest heaving and her hands shaking and everything shaking, and the stove was there, the warm white solidity of it in the center of the room, radiating heat into the air, the way it had been radiating heat for 2 months, and the floor was warm beneath her feet. Outside, the temperature was still falling. It would fall through the rest of the afternoon and through the night and keep falling, reaching depths that the plains had not seen in living memory. And in farmhouses and homesteads across Turner County, iron stoves were consuming the last of their wood and their furniture and their floorboards, and then going cold, and families were sitting in the dark in temperatures that had no interest in the distinction between the living and the dead. In a 14-foot tar paper shack that a land agent had written off in August, Owen Merritt lay shaking on a floor that was warm beside a stove built from clay and memory, and a dead woman's handwriting, while his sister knelt beside him, and Copper pressed his body against Owen's back and did not move. Not far away in a farmhouse with real walls and 12 cords of buried hardwood and the best iron stove money could buy in Freeman, Gerald Ashford stood in a stripped and freezing kitchen and knew with the particular clarity that crisis brings that he had run out of things to burn. He looked at his wife. He looked at his son, Nathan, 15 years old, shaking steadily in the corner. He looked at the dead iron stove. He thought about a warm floor in a tar paper shack. He thought about a 15-year-old girl who had told him in October that the cold only cared about physics. He put on every piece of clothing he owned, and he told his family to do the same, and he opened the door into the storm. The journey to the Merritt homestead, in that weather for a 52-year-old man with a shaking wife and an adolescent son who could barely stay upright, was the kind of journey that a person only makes when the alternative is remaining where they are. Gerald made it the way Marion made it and the way Nathan made it because there was no other direction left. Nora Flynn and her mother were already inside as they had been since before the storm hit, and Copper had not left Owen's back in 6 hours, and the stove was still warm, and the floor beneath it was still warm, and the room that had once held 2 orphaned children and their dog was now holding 6 people and would hold more before the night was over. Iris had one task left before dawn. She had to do it alone. She put on everything she owned, picked up the rope and the compass, and looked at Owen. "Someone has to keep this room alive," she said. "That is you." Owen opened his notebook and began calculating. Fuel remaining, people in the room, hours estimated, rate of burn required. His hands were steady. Iris stepped into the storm to find the people who were still out there. The walk to the Ashford homestead took 45 minutes. 2 miles through drifts that came to Iris's waist in places with the wind driving ice horizontally into any exposed surface, and the temperature falling as she moved, dropping with the particular purposefulness of a thing that has been waiting for permission to do its worst. She could not see more than 2 feet in any direction. She navigated by compass and by the way the wind changed when it encountered structures, the subtle turbulence that buildings create in the air around them. A change in pressure you feel in the body before you recognize it in the mind. She found the Ashford house by feeling it before she saw it. Inside, Marion sat on the kitchen floor under the dead iron stove with her hands wrapped in strips of cloth torn from a curtain. The room had been stripped to the walls. The chairs were gone. The table was gone. Sections of the floorboards had been pried up and fed into the stove. One boarded item, and the stove had taken all of it and then gone cold anyway. And now the kitchen floor had holes in it where the wood had been, and the cold came up through those holes with no obstruction at all. Nathan was beside his mother with his head against her shoulder. He was 15 years old, broad like his father, gentle like his mother, and he had not stopped shaking since the previous night. He lifted his head when Iris came through the door. His face had the quality of someone who has been in a very cold place for a very long time and is no longer certain that warmth is a thing that exists in the world. "You built that stove," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with the focused attention of a person who has decided to hold on to something. "Did you know it would work?" Iris thought about Margaret's kitchen, about a warm surface and no fire burning, and the old woman's hand pressing flat against the clay. About the difference between the two things that people call by the same name, knowing and believing. How knowing happens in the mind and believing happens in the hands. "I did not know," she said. "I trusted. My grandmother told me it would work. I trusted her more than I trusted my own doubts." Nathan absorbed this. Outside the storm was an undifferentiated roar that had been the entire world for nearly 18 hours. The dead stove stood in the corner like a rebuke. "I want to learn," Nathan said, "when this is over. I want to know how to build something that does not fail when everything else does." Something passed between them in that cold kitchen that neither of them had the language for yet and would not have the language for years. Not love, not yet. Something earlier than love, something that needed time and warmth and shared work before it could become what it eventually became. But it started there, on a stripped floor with holes in it, in the worst cold either of them had ever survived, with a 15-year-old girl who had walked 2 miles through a blizzard to find him. The return took nearly an hour. Nathan walked under his own strength with Iris at his side. Marion walked by Will alone, her feet moving because her mind commanded them, each step a separate and deliberate decision against the cold that wanted her to stop. Copper had come with Iris without being asked, and for the entire return journey, the dog pressed against Nathan's legs and did not vary from that position by more than a few inches. When Marion Ashford stepped through the door of the tar paper shack and the warmth met her face, she stopped walking. She stood in the doorway with her eyes closed. The warmth touched her face and her hands and the skin of her neck, and something in her expression released some tension that had been holding everything together from the inside, and that she could finally let go of because she was somewhere the cold could not follow. She crossed to the stove and placed both of her wrapped hands against the whitewashed surface and held them there without speaking. Gerald moved to his wife and put his arm around her, and they stood together in front of the stove and did not say anything for a long time. Owen watched them from across the room with his notebook open in his lap and the fuel calculations on the page in front of him, and his face had the expression of a person witnessing something he had not expected to be allowed to see. Father Aldrich came in the evening of the second day. He came alone and on foot, and he arrived at the door with his face the color of old chalk and his lips dark with cold, and Iris opened the door before he knocked because Copper had heard his footsteps in the snow. The priest stepped inside and stood in the warmth for a long moment without speaking. His breathing slowed. The color began to return to his hands. Then he sat down on the warm floor and looked up at Iris. "I said something in October," he said, "about where your knowledge came from. I suggested it was not from God." He paused. "I was too proud to see what I was actually looking at." Iris waited. "God has many ways of teaching his children," Father Aldrich said. "Sometimes through scripture, sometimes through the hands of grandmothers." He placed his palm flat against the warm floor. "I was wrong. Will you forgive me?" Iris was 15 years old, and she had buried both her parents within 3 weeks of each other and built a stove from memory and clay and walked through a blizzard twice in 2 days. And she had developed through all of that a very clear understanding of what forgiveness actually is. It is not something you give for the other person's sake. It is something you give for your own, because the weight of carrying anger is heavier than the weight of letting it go, and you need both hands free for the work in front of you. "There is nothing to forgive," she said. "You did not know. Now you know." Father Aldrich sat on the warm floor for the rest of that night and did not leave until the storm broke. Silas Graves arrived at dawn on the third day. He was 72 years old, and he had walked 2 miles through the last hours of the blizzard because he needed to know, not because he required shelter, not because he was in danger, because he had touched a warm wall in Bergen 50 years ago and had never fully stopped thinking about it, and he needed to see with his own eyes whether the thing he had touched once and never touched again had survived the crossing to this cold new world. He stood in the doorway and looked at the stove and looked at the 9 people on the warm floor and looked at Iris. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has lived long enough to see a truth proven twice and finds in the repetition not surprise but the deep-settled satisfaction of being right about something that mattered. "Good," he said. He sat down. 9 people in a 12 by 14-foot tar paper shack in Turner County, Dakota Territory. A brown dog pressed against the back of a young man who had stopped shaking. A whitewashed clay stove that had kept them warm through 3 days of 40 below on less fuel than most families burned in a single morning. Outside, 200 people were dead across the Great Plains. Inside this room, 9 people were alive. And in the corner on the last of the fuel, Iris fed the stove another handful of twisted grass and watched the brief, bright fire take it and felt the clay begin its patient, unhurried work of remembering. Sheriff James Colton and his men arrived at noon. Colton stood in the doorway with the warm air rolling against his face and his mouth slightly open, in the particular expression of a man who was revising everything he thought he knew about what was possible. His best tracker, Eric Svensson, walked past him without speaking and stood in front of the stove and took off his hat and held it against his chest with both hands. House Svensson said, a single word, hanging in the warm air of the room like a question that had been a long time finding the right place to be asked. Not how, as in explain the mechanics. The mechanics were visible to anyone who stood in that room and felt the warmth and looked at the fuel supply in the corner. How as in, how is it possible that two orphan children with $43 built something that worked when everything that was supposed to work had failed? Colton placed his palm against the stove. He knelt and placed it on the floor. He opened his notebook and looked at the remaining bundle of grass in the corner for a long time. How much fuel, he said, in 3 days? Iris pointed to the bundle. About a third of it gone. Colton looked at the bundle, looked at the stove, looked at the 9 surviving people. He wrote in his notebook, and he knew even as he wrote that whatever he put on that page would not be adequate to describe what he was looking at. The days after the storm were the days of reckoning. The official count would eventually reach more than 200 dead across the Great Plains. In Turner County alone, the losses were enough to change how people talked about winter preparation for a generation. Families who had done everything right, everything they had been told was sufficient, had lost people they loved to cold that arrived without warning and lasted longer than their resources. Gerald Ashford stood in the Merritt shack 3 days after the storm broke and looked at the stove for a long time. He looked at his wife's hands, which the warmth of that floor had saved from amputation. He looked at his son Nathan, who had color in his face again, and had spent 2 of the past 3 days asking Iris questions about channel geometry and firebox ratios with the focused intensity of a person who has decided to understand something completely. I called you fools, Gerald said. His voice had the roughness of a man speaking through something he had been carrying for a while. I looked at your bricks and I laughed to myself. I said you were building your own graves. I thought I knew better because I had been here 16 winters and you were children. He put his hand on the warm surface of the stove. I was wrong. You saved my wife. You saved my son. You saved me. And I will spend the rest of my life telling people what I saw in this room. He stood there with his hand on the warm clay, and Iris watched him and understood what this cost a man like Gerald Ashford, who had spent 7 years believing there was no better way and had built his life around the tools available to him and had lost a daughter to those tools anyway. The admission was not just about the stove. It was about grace, about the question he had been carrying since 1881 and had finally found the answer to too late for the person he had most wanted to save, but not too late for everyone else. Edna Cartwright came in March. She stood on the step for a long moment before she knocked. When Iris opened the door, Edna did not speak immediately. She stood with her hands clasped and her eyes slightly downcast, in the posture of a person who has rehearsed what they came to say and is now discovering that the rehearsal did not adequately prepare them. I said things, she finally managed, about you and your brother, about what you were building. I called you mad. I made sure everyone in Freeman heard me say it. She looked up. Her eyes were wet. My sister-in-law died in the blizzard, in her own house with her own stove. She died 40 feet from a woodpile she could not reach. She had done everything right. Everything anyone told her was right, and she died anyway. Her voice broke, and she let it break and did not try to manage it. Teach me, please, so that no one I love ever dies that way again. Iris stepped aside and let her in. Douglas Hale came at the end of February. He came alone without his usual posture of administrative authority, without the leather notebook that he normally kept as a kind of distance between himself and whatever he was appraising. He walked around the stove slowly and examined it the way a man examines something that has defeated him, noting its qualities with the careful attention of someone trying to understand exactly where his calculations went wrong. He tapped one of the fired bricks with his knuckle. He read the whitewashed surface with his eyes. He stood for a long time looking at the floor without putting his hand to it, as though that contact would require him to acknowledge something he was not quite ready to acknowledge with his body, even though his mind had already arrived there. Iris watched him from across the room. She knew what he had done. Not the specific letters, not the precise mechanism of the obstruction, but the shape of it. The land agent who had declared their survival prospects non-existent and then made certain that every avenue of assistance remained closed. The man who had told Gerald Ashford that a respected community voice might be useful if things went wrong. The man who had stood in Owen's doorway in December and left only when Owen did not react the way he had expected. She also knew that Hale knew she knew or suspected she knew, and that this knowledge was sitting in his chest like something he could not put down and could not carry comfortably and would not be able to set down for the rest of his life. Some reckonings do not happen in public. Some happen only inside the person who has earned them in the private accounting of a man who adds up what he has done and has to live with the sum. Hale stood by the door and looked at her. Improvements adequate, he said, claim valid. He put on his hat and went out. Owen stood beside Iris and watched through the window as Hale rode away across the snow. The silence between them was the comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together and do not need to fill every gap with words. He knows what he tried to do, Owen said quietly. Maybe, Iris said. You are not angry. Iris considered this. She looked at the snow-covered fields that were their land, 160 acres of Dakota prairie that belonged to them now, and would belong to them in the spring and in every spring after that. I do not have time to be angry, she said. I have our land. I have our future. I have the right to stay. That is not fair. No, but the floor's warm, and sometimes that is all you need. Owen looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back out the window at the empty place where Hale had been. He nodded once slowly in the way that people nod when they have accepted something they cannot change and have decided that acceptance is more useful than resistance. The following week, a short letter arrived at Hale's office from Preston Ward in Sioux Falls. It said, no longer necessary. Pursuing other properties. There was no apology in it, no acknowledgement of what had been attempted, just the flat, businesslike pivot of a man with enough resources to absorb a failed plan and redirect without breaking stride. That was the last either of them heard of Preston Ward. He did not appear at their door. He did not demand an explanation or offer one. He simply moved on to the next thing, the way men with enough money move on smoothly and without friction, leaving behind only the absence of a threat that most people would never know had existed. The most dangerous man in their story had not been defeated. He had simply lost interest. Spring came, and with the spring came the work of turning what had happened into something that could keep happening. Walter Brennan formalized the craft. He standardized the brick dimensions and improved the channel geometry based on observations from the winter small refinements that made the heat distribution more even in larger structures. He began training young men from across Turner County to build the stoves for families who wanted them, but lacked the knowledge or the physical capacity to build alone. Billy Crane, who had bet $5 that the Merritt children would not survive until Christmas, became one of Walter's first students, and by the following autumn, his most accomplished one. Walter told him so directly and without ceremony one afternoon after examining a completed stove, and Billy received the compliment by looking at the floor for a long moment without speaking. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. He never mentioned the bet publicly. He did not need to. The stove he built for his own family that winter was its own answer to every doubt he had ever expressed. Owen married Nora Flynn in the summer of 1890. They had 4 children together. Each one learned to work clay before they learned to ride a horse. Each one could describe the principles of the channel system from memory by the age of 7, not because they had been drilled on them, but because the knowledge was simply part of the air they breathed, growing up part of what it meant to be who they were and to come from where they came from. Nora kept the notebook. She added her own notes in the margins, observations from 20 Dakota winters, small refinements and corrections that her hands had discovered through the specific and irreplaceable knowledge of doing. When she died, she left it to her oldest daughter. That daughter left it to her daughter. The handwriting on the pages moved across 4 generations, German, and then English, and then something in between. And the chain that had reached Iris's hands in a boarding house in Nebraska reached further than either of them had been able to see from there. Gerald Ashford built the first new masonry stove in Turner County in April, in the kitchen of the house he rebuilt after the blizzard. Iris supervised. When the stove was finished and the first fire had been fed and the clay had begun its work, Gerald stood in his rebuilt kitchen and placed his palm against the warm surface and held it there for a long time. That evening, he walked alone to the Freeman churchyard. He stood in front of the small stone that marked Grace Ashford, 7 years old, dead in the winter of 1881. He stood with his hat in his hands the way he had always stood there, but something in it was different now, not lighter, different. The difference between a man who is standing before an unanswered question and a man who is standing before a question that has finally been answered too late for the person who mattered most, but not too late for everyone else. He did not speak to the stone. He never had. He simply stood for longer than usual, and when he turned and walked back toward the road, the way he moved had changed in a way that was difficult to name, but visible to anyone who knew him well enough to notice. By the following winter, 17 homesteads in Turner County had working masonry stoves. The winter after that, no one bothered to count. The knowledge had moved the way useful knowledge always moves when it is allowed to hand, from household to household, from the person who understood it to the person who needed it. Owen and Iris proved their homestead in 1892. 5 years after arriving with $43 in a creaking wagon and a notebook in a canvas bag, they stood in Douglas Hale's office and signed the papers that made 160 acres of Dakota prairie legally and permanently theirs. Hale stamped the documents and filed them without comment. As Iris walked toward the door, she noticed that the hand holding the stamp was not entirely steady. She thought about her father, who had wanted land more than anything and had not lived long enough to stand on it. She thought about her mother, who had held on long enough to point the way. She thought about Margaret Hartwell, who had never seen Dakota Territory and never would, and who had nevertheless sent her knowledge there through the body and hands in memory of a granddaughter who had decided at a creek bank in the early morning dark that the old woman had not lied. Outside in the spring sunlight, Owen stood beside her in comfortable silence. "We should go home," he said eventually. Iris looked at him, and for the first time since they had been standing at their mother's grave in a town they would forget, the name of the word home did not refer to a place they were trying to reach. It referred to a place they already were. Iris married Nathan Ashford in the spring of 1893, the son of the man who had called her a fool, the boy who had been shaking on a stripped kitchen floor and had asked with the simple directness of someone who has just been saved and wanted to understand the mechanism of his salvation, to be taught how to build something that did not fail. Father Aldrich performed the ceremony at the Freeman Church and gave by general agreement the finest sermon of his career. He spoke about wisdom that arrives from unexpected directions, about the pride that blinds a man to the truth standing in front of him, about what it means to be wrong about something important and to be given the chance to do something useful with the wrongness. Several people told him afterward that it was the best they had ever heard from him. He accepted this with the particular grace of a man being praised for his willingness to admit an error, which is a different thing entirely from being praised for being right. Gerald stood at the altar beside his son. His eyes were wet, and no one mentioned it. After the ceremony, he found Iris alone in the churchyard where the spring grass was beginning to come in green between the old stones. He stood with his hat in his hands, the same gesture she had seen him use at Grace's grave. "She would be your age now," he said quietly. Grace, if she had lived. Iris understood everything contained in those few words. What it had cost him to say them, and what he was asking without asking, and what it meant that he was asking her rather than anyone else. "Then I will try to live in a way that would have been worthy of her," Iris said. Gerald put his hat on. He nodded once. He walked away. They never spoke of it again. But every time they met for the rest of his life, at church or at market or at the gatherings that small communities hold, to remind themselves they are not alone, he acknowledged her in a particular way. A nod that was not the general nod of a neighbor, the specific nod of a man who knows he was wrong and is grateful every single morning that being wrong did not cost him everything. Copper died in January of 1901. He was 14 years old, and he died on the kitchen floor beside the masonry stove that had replaced the original years before. His head on his paws, his tail straight in the posture of a dog who has long since identified the warmest spot in the house and has held it as his own against all comers. Iris found him when she came in from the barn and knew before she knelt beside him. She sat on the warm floor and put her hand on his head and stayed there for a long time, feeling the stove's warmth at her back in the stillness of 14 years of faithful company settling into memory. Owen carved the headstone himself. He worked slowly and carefully with the attention he gave to anything he had decided deserved his best. The stone said, "Copper the best listener." Iris Merritt Ashford died in January of 1934. She was 79 years old, and the month was appropriate in every way. January had always been her month, the month that had taken the most from her and given the most back, the month that had tested her and defined her in ways that no other season could claim. She died in her own bed in the farmhouse that had replaced the tar paper shack decades before a real house, with real walls and real windows and a masonry stove in the kitchen that Walter Brennan had helped design and that her own children had helped build, and that had kept the family warm for 30 winters without a single failure. Outside the windows, a new storm was coming down from the north. The fields were white. The sky had the hard, specific quality of a January sky that has made up its mind. The world looked, if you narrowed your eyes slightly against the glare, not so very different from the world she had arrived in 47 years before. The stove in the kitchen was warm. Her children and grandchildren were gathered around her. A granddaughter of 9 sat on the edge of the bed, holding her hand, the smallest and the most attentive, the one who had spent the previous summer learning to mix clay in the yard with a focused seriousness that reminded everyone present of someone they had all heard about, but none of them except Iris had actually known. The faces around the bed carried the marks of everyone Iris had loved. Her mother's patience in one face, her father's jaw in another, and in the hands of the youngest granddaughter, without anyone having intended it, something that belonged to a woman in Ukraine who had never seen any of them, and who had nevertheless made all of them possible. Iris looked at those hands for a long time. Then she closed her eyes and spoke her last words in German, the language she had learned before English, the language of the notebook, the language of the kitchen in Ukraine where everything that mattered had begun. "Warm," she said. "The floor's warm." And she was gone. Her grave stands in the Freeman churchyard beside Nathan's near the small stone that marks Grace Ashford, who died in 1881 at the age of 7, and whose death set in motion a question that a 15-year-old girl with $43 and a cracked leather notebook eventually answered. The inscription on Iris's stone is in German and English, both the two languages of her life, the two languages of the knowledge she carried. She knew how to keep warm. And now at the end of this story, there is one more thing that needs to be said. Not about Iris, about the question she carried. Think about what she was holding when she knelt at the creek bank in the dark in August of 1887. Not just clay, not just a notebook. The accumulated understanding of people who had faced the same problems she was facing and had solved it and had written the solution down and had made sure the writing reached the hands of someone who would need it. That is what survived. Not the shack which was replaced, not the original stove which was eventually rebuilt, not the $43 which were spent. What survived was the knowledge. The chain of hands that had carried it from Margaret Hartwell's kitchen to a creek bank in Dakota Territory. The decision of a woman who knew she was running out of time to make certain the things she knew did not die with her. Think about what you know that someone taught you. Think about the knowledge that lives in your hands from the people who guided them. Think about what might be sitting in a notebook somewhere, or in a memory you have not visited in years, or in the hands of someone who is waiting for you to ask the right question. Iris Merritt was 15 years old when she built a stove that saved 9 lives. She built it from clay and trust. The trust came from knowing that the woman who had taught her had tested the knowledge through 72 winters and had found it true. That knowledge crossed an ocean. It survived 2 graves. It held against the worst blizzard in American history. It kept a floor warm in a tar paper shack while 200 people died across the Great Plains. And it is still warm. It has always been warm. It will stay warm for as long as someone remembers how to build it and for as long as someone decides that what their grandmother knew is worth carrying forward into whatever winter comes next.